Thou hast journeyed far and overcome much. Come hither, child. I am Gwynevere, daughter of Lord Gwyn and Queen of Sunlight. If thou so needest, I shall devote all to thine safety.
A knight of the goddess does not die.
Hey there, I'm Jake the Ashen Hollow, and I hope you're all doing well. In this video, we'll be talking about the idea that Lord Gwyn's eldest daughter Gwynevere has, after a long life, become Rosaria, the mother of Rebirth. I realized that it's something I'd brought up in several past videos to pair with other theories, but never actually made a standalone video for, so here it goes. Gwynevere, the Princess of Sunlight, Goddess of Bounty and Fertility, Queen of Lothric, and Mother of Rebirth. Quite an impressive resume, to be sure. But before I explain why or how I think Gwynevere became Rosaria, I think it's important to first peg her as the Queen of Lothric, as I believe it lends to Rosaria's story, as well as help make sense as to why Gwynevere would even be in Lothric in the first place. The best way to do this is to simply look at the divine blessing from both Dark Souls 1 and 3. The divine blessing is described in 1 as holy water blessed by Gwynevere, who is cherished by all as the symbol of bounty and fertility. And in 3, it's described as the holy water blessed by the Queen of Lothric, who was initially revered as the goddess of bounty and fertility, and after giving birth to her youngest ocelot, quietly disappeared. The comparisons and similarities are pretty clear, and I'd be hard-pressed to believe these two descriptions are talking about two separate entities who happen to basically be the exact same person. But what's more is the Sun Princess ring from both 1 and 3. In 1, it describes Gwynevere's departure from Anor Londo, and later becoming wife to Flame God Flann. Whereas the ring in 3 also describes her departure from Anor Londo, it doesn't mention Flann. It simply states that she became a wife and mother, who raised several heavenly children. So Flann could be a retcon, as we know that at least near the end, the Queen of Lothric was married to Osiros. Or, as I said in the first video I ever made, perhaps the divorce rate is high in Lothric. Regardless, the important piece is the mention of Gwynevere having several heavenly children, as the Queen of Lothric is often referenced as having raised several heavenly children. If all that isn't enough to convince you, well, then you could also consider this. Joining the Princess's Guard in Dark Souls 1 grants you the ability to use Gwynevere's 2 signature miracles, Soothing and Bountiful Sunlight, both of which are said to be granted to the Maidens of Gwynevere, which is a bit more interesting if you know that back in the day the Maidens of Queens were often her daughters. And a bit sad to remember that you get these 2 miracles from the 2 Picasas in the Duke's archives, which could have been 2 of Gwynevere's children, but that isn't super important to the story. What is that we can transpose the Dancer's soul into the Soothing Sunlight miracle. And the Dancer is of course referred to as the distant daughter of the formal royal family, which in this case I assume means the Lothric royal family. So, the Dancer being a daughter of the Queen of Lothric, who also wears the mirage-like Aurora veil, which is said to be an article of the Old Gods, permitted only for direct descendants of the old royal family, which is of course a reference to the original royal family of Gwyn and his children this time, isn't a surprise. The beauty of Dark Souls lore is that for the most part you can write your own stories and believe and enjoy it however you want. But for me, the evidence is far too overwhelming for me to believe that the Queen of Lothric is anyone but Gwynevere. Now, let's look at why it also makes sense that Gwynevere has become Rosaria, the mother of Rebirth. Starting with the obvious, I don't think it's a stretch to believe that Rosaria, the entity who can literally rebirth people into someone else, could also alter her own appearance. Not to mention the concepts of fertility and rebirth aren't vastly different from one another. And since Gwynevere was the goddess of fertility, I assume she'd excel at the birthing or rebirthing process. And since bounty and fertility are, as far as we know, only associated with Gwynevere, it's interesting to see literal symbols of fertility all around Rosaria's bedchambers. And I suppose consider this as a warning, as I'm about to show you a diagram of the female reproductive system, the ultimate icon of fertility, so that you can see the symbolism to it in the reliefs around Rosaria's room. In this one, the goats and satyrs are also age-old symbols of fertility, and the abundance of blossom flowers as well. You could also consider their shape to be similar to the uterus, and the ribbons to resemble fallopian tubes. And the abundance of vegetation could also represent bounty. In this relief, we can definitely see the shape resemblance of the reproductive system, which consists of an oak branch with acorns, which is another widely used symbol of fertility. Acorns were also often used in rituals of self-rebirth, so there's that too. The cribs around the bedchamber could also represent fertility or rebirth, or both even. But obviously, the parallels are apparent around Rosaria's room. And that's all not even to mention yet that during Leonard's questline, he takes Rosaria's soul to the very room we met the illusion of Gwynevere during Dark Souls 1. And transposing Rosaria's soul, we get the second of Gwynevere's exclusive miracles in Bountiful Sunlight. But there is a distinct difference this time, and I think it's super interesting. In one, the miracles were referenced as granted to maidens of Gwynevere, that dropped from the Picasas we can assume were her maidens, and the soothing sunlight transposed from the dancer's soul says the same, that it was granted to maidens of Gwynevere. Except the difference this one time is that Bountiful Sunlight in Dark Souls 3 doesn't mention being granted to maidens of Gwynevere. It simply says it's a miracle granted by Gwynevere. I think the distinction was made because the miracle is transposed by Rosaria or Gwynevere's soul itself. It's a small but very important distinction. There's already so many things that I believe prove Rosaria to be who Gwynevere eventually became, after all she had been through. There is even the Aurora mirage-like veils permitted only to the old gods and royal family hanging throughout the bedchambers. And there is more that lends to this theory by believing that Gwynevere was the Queen of Lothric. Above all else that Gwynevere valued, I think her children were atop that list, and protecting those dear to her takes precedence. Even upon entering the princess's guard, she vows to protect you above all else. In the time of Lothric, things aren't quite going well for some of the queen's children. Namely Gertrude, who was locked away high above in the Grand Archives, and the dancer, who had sided with Sullivan and taken to Irithyll and eventually warped into a beast. So it's interesting to see man-grubs, those who worshipped Rosaria and have used her service one too many times, becoming something a bit less than human, in peculiar places in regards to those two daughters. We see one high up in the banisters of the Grand Archives near the cage where Gertrude was imprisoned, and we see one that appears to have been killed trying to make its way into Irithyll, presumably towards the dancer. Which, in my mind, was Rosaria using her servants in an attempt to protect and watch over her daughters. It's also interesting to consider that when Aldrich decided he would devour the gods, he started with the old gods, Gwyndolin to be specific, after Sullivan locked them away for the Saint of the Deep to devour. Similarly, Rosaria appears to have been locked away as well, as we can see the gates around her chambers, and it was in the Cathedral of the Deep no less. But of course, the gate was eventually broken into, and is made to distinctively appear as if it was broken and forced open. This was probably done by her mangrub servants to keep her from getting devoured by Aldrich, as we can see dead mangrubs around the chambers, along with the surviving ones still guarding their goddess. And the sludge all over the wall could suggest that Aldrich was there and attempted to devour her but was thwarted. Of course, that's all inconsequential, but interesting nonetheless if we're considering Rosaria to be Gwynevere, an old god and sister to Gwyndolin. The final thing we'll talk about is Rosaria's inability to speak. The obscuring ring says that Rosaria was robbed of her tongue by her firstborn, and has been awaiting for their return ever since, which could mean a couple of different things. I think a lot of people correlate it to mean her tongue was physically removed by her firstborn, especially considering her covenant offers her the tongues of their victims. But the Pale Tongues describe the ritual as originally being a practice of an infamous troop of invaders who offered them to their speechless goddess. But I don't think that has to mean that Rosaria's tongue was physically removed. People have taken vows of silence before. People have just also fallen silent for long periods of time, especially after becoming stricken with grief. And robbed of her tongue isn't mutually exclusive to having it actually removed. Just like saying someone took your breath away could go both ways. What if after everything else we see that Gwynevere's been through, her firstborn simply broke her heart so badly she just lost who she was, including her voice? If the dancer is her firstborn, her daughter siding with and making vows with the Pontiff Sullivan could have put her over the edge, especially considering Sullivan's endgame and the things he had already done to their family. That could also be the reference to the line from Divine Blessing about her quietly disappearing after giving birth to Ocelot. Which, let's be honest, that whole thing with Ocelot was probably another huge tragedy in itself. So she quietly, literally faded away, robbed of her tongue by her distant daughter. Heartbroken, she then was reborn, still ever waiting for her daughter to return to her. But against all odds, she was still a mother to all who wanted or needed her.